The gunshots had faded into the night, but for Josephine Owens, the echoes remained, haunting her like ghosts as she stared out at the barren landscape of Gunnison, Colorado, in the summer of 1878. The small homestead that had once been filled with laughter now stood as a hollow reminder of everything she had lost. The drought had claimed their crops, bandits had taken her father's life, and the mounting debts threatened to rob her of the only home she'd ever known. Josephine wiped the sweat from her brow as she hauled another bucket of water from the well. At 24, she had never imagined her life would come to this, struggling alone to maintain a failing farm, with each passing day dimming her prospects for survival. The land that had promised so much when her family moved west now seemed determined to break her spirit entirely. "Miss Owens," the familiar voice of Mr. Harrison, the banker, called out as his carriage approached the property. Josephine's shoulders tensed. She set the bucket down and smoothed her worn dress, a futile attempt to restore dignity to a situation that had none. "I believe you know why I'm here," Harrison said, not bothering to dismount from his carriage. "The payment is 2 weeks overdue." "I know, Mr. Harrison." "I'll have it for you by the end of the month," she replied, the rehearsed words sounding hollow even to her own ears. The banker's face remained impassive. "That's what you said last month, Miss Owens. I've been patient out of respect for your father, God rest his soul, but my patience has limits. You have until the end of the week, or we'll begin proceedings to claim the property." Josephine watched his carriage disappear down the dusty road, her hands trembling. How would she find the money in 5 days when she hadn't managed it in 5 months? The last of her father's savings had gone to his funeral, and no one in town was hiring a woman for decent wages. She had tried selling eggs from her few remaining hens, but it was barely enough to feed herself, let alone pay off a mortgage. That night, as she sat by the light of a single candle, Josephine calculated her options for the 100th time. Selling the farm wouldn't cover the debts. Moving to Denver might offer more opportunities, but the journey alone would cost what little she had left. Marriage had once seemed her most likely path, but the war had taken too many young men, and those who remained had their pick of brides who brought prosperity rather than debt to a union. Sleep eluded her as she listened to the wind howling outside her window. It seemed to taunt her with its freedom, reminding her of her own imprisonment by circumstance. When morning came, Josephine rose with leaden limbs, her mind foggy from exhaustion. She forced herself through the motions of her daily chores, each movement a battle against the whisper of defeat that grew louder with every passing hour. 3 days passed in this fashion, each sunrise bringing her closer to the inevitable loss of everything. On the 4th morning, Josephine was startled from her melancholy by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, not just Harrison returning to gloat over her failure. Grabbing her father's old rifle, she stepped onto the porch, squinting against the morning sun to make out the approaching figures. A cattle drive. The sight of the massive herd moving across her land sent equal waves of irritation and relief through her. While they had no right to cross her property without permission, cattle meant cowboys, and cowboys meant potential work if she could convince them to pay for supplies or services. The lead rider broke away from the group, directing his horse toward her porch. As he drew closer, Josephine kept the rifle visible but lowered, a clear message that strangers weren't welcome without invitation, but that she wasn't looking for trouble. The man who approached was tall, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hat. A layer of trail dust covered his clothes, but even so, there was something commanding about his presence. When he removed his hat, she was surprised to see he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 29 or 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Madam," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Yates Zimmerman. Sorry to cross your land without asking, but the usual trail was washed out from the flash flood 3 days back." Josephine maintained her stance. "You're welcome to water your herd at the creek, Mr. Zimmerman, but I'll have to ask for payment. 5 cents per head is the standard rate." A slight smile tugged at his lips. "Fair enough, though 5 cents might bankrupt my boss. We're running close to 2,000 head." "Would 3 cents be acceptable?" The sum he was offering would cover at least half of what she owed Harrison. Josephine struggled to maintain her composure, not wanting to appear desperate. 4 cents, and your men can refill their supplies from my well. He considered her for a moment, his eyes taking in the state of the farm, the patched roof, the fallow fields, the noticeable absence of farmhands. Done, he finally said, and we'd be willing to pay extra for any fresh food you might be able to provide. Been eating nothing but beans and salt pork for weeks. Josephine's mind raced with calculations. The garden had yielded a decent crop despite the drought, and she had preserves from the previous fall that she'd been saving. I can manage that, she said, lowering the rifle completely. How long will you be stopping? Just until tomorrow morning. We need to let the cattle rest and the men could use a night not spent in the saddle. He gestured toward the fields. That's good grazing land you've got, even with the drought. Shame it's not being used. The observation stung, but Josephine bit back a retort. It was used plenty when my father was alive. These days I manage what I can. Something in Yates' expression shifted. My apologies, Miss Owens, Josephine Owens, Miss Owens. I didn't mean to imply, it's fine, Mr. Zimmerman, she interrupted, not wanting his pity. Make camp by the creek. I'll have some food ready for your men by sundown. As he rode back to the herd, Josephine allowed herself a moment of relief. This unexpected opportunity might just buy her enough time to figure out a more permanent solution. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity, as Josephine prepared the largest meal she had cooked since her father's funeral. The cowboys made camp by the creek, their presence bringing a strange energy to the quiet farm. She could hear their voices and occasional laughter as they set up their temporary quarters and tended to the cattle. As promised, Yates appeared at her door at sundown with payment for the water rights. His eyes widened at the spread. She had prepared fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and a venison stew made with meat she'd been saving. This is mighty generous, Miss Owens, he said, as several of his men carried the food back to their camp. Most ranchers we pass offer nothing more than hard biscuits and maybe some potatoes. I'm not most ranchers, she replied, and I keep my word when I make a deal. Yates nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Would you care to join us? Seems a shame for you to eat alone after cooking for an army. The invitation caught her off guard. Propriety dictated she should decline a single woman dining with a group of trail-worn cowboys, would certainly set tongues wagging if anyone from town saw. But the prospect of company, of conversation that didn't center around her failures or debts, was too tempting to resist. I suppose I could, she said cautiously, just to ensure everything is satisfactory. The trail camp was organized with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. A large fire burned at the center, with bedrolls and saddles arranged in a rough circle around it. The cattle grazed nearby, watched over by 2 riders who would take the first night shift. The cowboys greeted Josephine with surprising politeness, many of them removing their hats as Yates introduced her. There were about 15 men in total, a mixture of ages and backgrounds united by the dusty clothes and weathered skin that marked them as men who lived under the open sky. As they ate, Josephine found herself drawn into their conversations, stories of the trail, of the towns they had passed through, of the ranch in Wyoming that was their destination. It was a world entirely different from her own, one of constant movement and changing horizons. How long have you been driving cattle, Mr. Zimmerman? She asked as they finished their meal. Going on 10 years now, he replied, accepting a cup of coffee from one of his men. Started as a regular hand, worked my way up to trail boss 3 years back. And you enjoy this life? Always moving, never staying in one place, Yates considered the question. There's a freedom to it that I can't imagine giving up. Every day brings something new, different weather, different challenges, different landscapes, makes a man feel alive. It also makes a man homeless, she observed, then immediately regretted the words. I'm sorry, that was unkind. But Yates didn't seem offended. No need to apologize for speaking truth. You're right that we don't have roots in the traditional sense. But I'd argue that the whole country is my home. I've slept under stars from Texas to Montana, and I know the rhythms of the land better than most who claim to own it." The way he spoke with quiet confidence and a genuine love for his way of life stirred something in Josephine. For so long, she had seen her attachment to her family's land as her strength, her defining purpose. But in this moment, it felt more like the anchor that was dragging her down into depths from which she might never resurface. As the evening progressed, one of the cowboys produced a harmonica, filling the camp with melancholy tunes that seemed to perfectly capture the vastness of the land around them. Another man told stories that had the group alternating between laughter and thoughtful silence. It was the most pleasant evening Josephine had experienced in months, perhaps even since before her father's death. When she finally rose to leave, Yates walked her back to her house, carrying a lantern to light their way. "Your men are quite the gentlemen," she remarked. "Not what I expected from cowboys," he chuckled. "Don't let them fool you. They can be as rough as any when the situation calls for it. But a good trail boss knows that respect and discipline make for fewer problems on a long drive." They reached her porch, and Josephine found herself reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Zimmerman. It was a welcome change." He studied her face in the lantern light. "If you don't mind me asking, how long have you been managing this place alone?" "8 months," she answered, "since my father was killed by bandits on his way back from Denver." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice brought a lump to her throat. "Thank you." She paused, then decided to continue. "The truth is, I'm not managing it at all. The bank is for closing by the end of the week. Your cattle drive came just in time to delay the inevitable, but not to stop it." Yates was quiet for a moment. "What will you do?" It was a question Josephine had asked herself countless times without finding a satisfactory answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "Try to find work in town, I suppose, or head to Denver, though I have no connections there." "It's a difficult path for a woman alone," he said, his tone neither pitying nor dismissive, simply acknowledging the reality she faced. "I'm aware of that," she replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "But I have few alternatives," he nodded, seeming to respect her determination. "Well, Miss Owens, if there's anything my men or I can do before we leave tomorrow, you need only ask. Unless you're in the market for a drought-stricken farm with more debts than assets, I'm afraid there's little to be done," she said with a rueful smile. "But I appreciate the offer." As he turned to leave, a sudden thought struck her. "Actually, there is one thing. If any of your men have garments that need mending, I could do that for them tonight. My sewing skills are one thing that hasn't failed me yet." Yates smiled. "I'll let them know. Good night, Miss Owens. Good night, Mr. Zimmerman." As he walked back toward the camp, Josephine watched his retreating figure until it merged with the darkness. Then she entered her empty house, strangely comforted by the sounds of the cattle drive that drifted through the night air. Morning arrived with a brisk clarity that belied the heaviness in Josephine's heart. She had stayed up late mending shirts, pants, and even a few pairs of socks for the cowboys, earning a few more precious dollars that would help her survival after leaving the farm. The work had kept her hands busy while her mind wrestled with the reality of her situation. In less than 3 days, this house would no longer be her home. She was just setting water to boil for coffee when a knock at her door announced Yates' return. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking as though he hadn't slept much. "Morning, Miss Owens. I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, Mr. Zimmerman. I was just making coffee. Would you care for some?" He accepted with a nod, and she invited him inside, acutely aware of the modest state of her home. The furniture was worn but clean, the floors swept, and the few decorative items a sampler she had stitched as a girl. Her mother's china displayed in a small cabinet gave the room a touch of femininity despite its simplicity. "I've been thinking about your situation," Yates said as she poured the coffee, "and I have a proposition for you." Josephine's hand stilled momentarily. In her experience, propositions from men usually came with conditions that compromised a woman's dignity. But there was nothing in Yates' demeanor that suggested such intentions. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, passing him the cup. "A business arrangement," he clarified. "My men and I are contracted to deliver these cattle to the Blackwell Ranch in Wyoming Territory. We're short-handed as it is, and we lost our cook 2 weeks back when he decided to stay in Santa Fe with a woman he fancied himself in love with." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job as your cook, Mr. Zimmerman?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The pay is $30 a month, plus room and board, such as it is on the trail. It would get you to Wyoming with money in your pocket, and the Blackwells are always looking for help on their ranch. They've got one of the largest operations in the territory, and Mrs. Blackwell in particular might appreciate another woman around the place." It was an unexpected lifeline, but Josephine hesitated. "I've never been more than 50 miles from Gunnison in my life, Mr. Zimmerman, and traveling with a group of men." "Your reputation would be protected," he assured her quickly. "You'd have your own wagon, and my men know better than to step out of line. Anyone who did would answer to me personally." The opportunity was tempting more than tempting. It offered not just escape from her immediate problems, but a path to something new. Yet the thought of leaving the only home she'd ever known filled her with dread. How long would the journey take? About 5 weeks, given the pace of the cattle. We'd reach the Blackwell Ranch by late August. 5 weeks. The bank would have sold her farm by then, erasing the physical remnants of her family's dreams. Perhaps it would be easier not to witness that final indignity. "I would need to settle matters with the bank before leaving," she said, surprising herself with the implication that she was considering his offer. "We can delay our departure until midday," Yates offered. "That should give you time to speak with the banker and gather whatever you wish to bring. The cook's wagon has space for your personal belongings." Josephine took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood at the edge of a precipice. "Let me think on it while I prepare breakfast for your men. I'll have an answer for you afterward." Yates nodded, finishing his coffee in silence. Before he left, he turned back to her. "For what it's worth, Miss Owens, I believe you do well in Wyoming. It's a hard land, but it rewards those with the courage to face its challenges." After he departed, Josephine sank into her father's old chair, trying to imagine a life beyond the boundaries of the farm. Every instinct told her to hold on, to fight until the bitter end. But for what purpose? To witness the dismantling of everything she loved. To be forced out with nothing rather than leaving on her own terms. By the time she arrived at the Cowboys' camp with baskets of biscuits, eggs, and bacon, she had made her decision. She would go with them to Wyoming, not as a defeat, but as a strategic retreat, a chance to rebuild her strength and resources before determining her next move. When she informed Yates of her choice, the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "You won't regret it, Miss Owens, I give you my word." The next few hours passed in a blur as Josephine rode into town to confront Harrison at the bank. The banker was surprised by her decision to surrender the property voluntarily, but not displeased. It saved him the trouble and expense of formal proceedings. "You understand that this settles the debt, but leaves you with nothing from the sale," he reminded her, almost gloating in his victory. "I understand the terms perfectly, Mr. Harrison," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "I only ask that you allow me to remove my personal belongings and family heirlooms before taking possession." With the paperwork signed, Josephine returned to the farm for the last time. She packed her clothing, her mother's china, her father's pocket watch, and a few books that had been treasured possessions. Everything else, the furniture, the farm implements, even the few remaining livestock, would be left behind. As she closed the door of her childhood home, Josephine allowed herself one moment of grief, one solitary tear for the life she was leaving behind. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked toward the waiting wagon without looking back. The cattle drive began its northward journey just after noon. Josephine rode in the cook's wagon, a canvas-covered conveyance filled with supplies, cooking equipment, and now her few possessions. From her perch on the driver's seat, she watched Gunnison grow smaller in the distance, the familiar landscape transforming into something new with each passing mile. By late afternoon, they made camp beside a small stream. Yates approached her wagon, looking concerned. "I realize we've thrown you into this rather suddenly. Do you need help figuring out the cooking arrangements?" Josephine smiled despite herself. "Mr. Zimmerman, I've been cooking for farm hands since I was 12 years old. I think I can manage a pot of beans and some cornbread for your cowboys." For the first time, she saw genuine amusement light his features. "I don't doubt it for a moment, Miss Owens. I'll leave you to it then." That evening, as the cowboys gathered around the fire to eat, Josephine found herself at the center of their attention, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a respect born of genuine appreciation for the meal she had prepared. "Best cornbread I've had since leaving Texas," declared an older cowboy with a grizzled beard. "The last cook couldn't tell cornmeal from sawdust, and he never washed the coffee pot proper," added another. "Always tasted like we were drinking mud." Josephine felt a small glow of pride at their compliments. It was a simple thing, but after months of failure and loss, the success of providing a good meal for hungry men was immensely satisfying. As the days passed, Josephine settled into the rhythm of trail life. She rose before dawn to start the breakfast fire, cooked 3 meals a day for 15 hungry men, washed dishes in streams and rivers, and learned to set up and break down her cooking equipment with increasing efficiency. The work was hard but straightforward, with a clear purpose that she found oddly comforting after the uncertainty of her previous situation. The land changed as they moved north, the familiar Colorado mountains giving way to the high plains of Wyoming territory. The days were hot, the nights cool, and the vast openness of the landscape sometimes left Josephine feeling exposed and vulnerable. But there was beauty too in the wildflowers that dotted the prairie, the dramatic cloud formations that swept across the enormous sky, and the herds of antelope that sometimes paralleled their route. A week into the journey, a sudden afternoon thunderstorm caught them in open country with no shelter. The cattle grew nervous as lightning split the sky, and the men worked frantically to keep the herd from stampeding. Josephine's wagon leaked, soaking her bedroll and much of the flour supply. By the time the storm passed, everyone was drenched and miserable. That evening, as she attempted to salvage what she could of the supplies, Yates appeared at her wagon. "How bad is the damage?" he asked, surveying the wet sacks of flour and beans laid out to dry. "We've lost about a quarter of the flour to water damage," she reported. "And most of the sugar has dissolved. We'll need to replenish supplies at the next town." He nodded, then noticed her shivering despite the warm evening. "You're soaked through. Don't you have dry clothes to change into?" "Everything got wet," she admitted. "The wagon cover tore during the worst of the storm." Without hesitation, Yates removed his coat, one of the few dry items among the entire company, as he'd stored it in an oilskin bag, and handed it to her. "Take this. I'll have one of the men fix your wagon cover before nightfall." The gesture was simple but touching. "Thank you," she said, wrapping the coat around her shoulders. It smelled of leather, horses, and a scent that was uniquely his, not unpleasant despite the days on the trail. "It's the least I can do," he replied. "You've kept your end of our bargain admirably, Miss Owens. Not many would adapt to trail life as quickly as you have." "I didn't have much choice," she reminded him. "There's always a choice," he countered. "You could have given up, sought the protection of a hasty marriage, or resigned yourself to a life of drudgery in someone else's household. Instead, you chose the harder path, the unknown." His assessment surprised her. She hadn't thought of her decision as brave, merely necessary. But seen through his eyes, perhaps there was courage in it after all. "Well," she said finally, "my father always said an Owens never backs down from a challenge. I suppose some lessons stick with you, even when everything else changes." Yates smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weather-beaten face. "Your father sounds like a man I would have respected. He would have liked you too," Josephine found herself saying. "He valued honesty and hard work above all else." They fell into a comfortable conversation as the camp settled around them. Yates told her about his own father, a Virginia farmer who had lost everything in the war, and his subsequent journey west to build a new life. Josephine shared stories of her childhood in Gunnison, of learning to ride almost before she could walk, and of the dreams her parents had held for their small farm. It was the longest conversation they had shared since her joining the cattle drive, and Josephine was struck by how easy it was to talk to him. Despite his position of authority among the men, there was nothing intimidating about Yates in these quieter moments. He listened as much as he spoke, asked questions that showed genuine interest, and shared his own experiences without boasting or embellishment. By the time they parted for the night, Josephine's clothes had dried by the fire, but she found herself reluctant to return Yates' coat. There was something comforting about the weight of it around her shoulders, like the physical manifestation of the protection he had promised her on this journey. "Keep it for tonight," he said, seeming to read her thoughts. "The temperature drops quickly out here. You can return it in the morning." As she settled into her repaired wagon for the night, wrapped in his coat and listening to the sounds of the sleeping camp, Josephine realized that for the first time in months, her thoughts were turned toward the future rather than the past. She had no idea what awaited her in Wyoming, but the prospect no longer filled her with dread. Instead, there was a cautious curiosity, a tentative hope that perhaps this forced uprooting might lead to something better than what she had left behind. The following days established a pattern that became almost comfortable. Josephine's skills as a cook improved as she adapted to the limitations of trail cooking, and the Cowboy's appreciation for her efforts was evident in their clean plates and frequent compliments. Even more satisfying was the gradual acceptance she earned not as an intruder or a burden, but as a valued member of the company. 2 weeks into the journey, they reached a small trading post where they could replenish supplies. It was hardly a town, just a cluster of buildings centered around the trading post itself, but after the isolation of the trail, it seemed a bustling metropolis to Josephine. While Yates negotiated for supplies, she seized the opportunity to purchase fabric for a new dress, thread for mending, and a few precious personal items that would make her life on the trail more comfortable. As they prepared to depart, the trading post owner's wife approached Josephine with a package wrapped in brown paper. "My husband mentioned you're traveling with the cattle drive," she said. "I thought you might appreciate some things that are hard to come by on the trail." Inside the package, Josephine found soap that smelled of lavender, a small jar of face cream, and a recent newspaper luxuries that brought tears to her eyes. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Bennett, and it's nothing, truly. I made the same journey 8 years ago when my husband decided to start this trading post. I remember how much these small comforts meant." Josephine impulsively hugged the older woman. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." Mrs. Bennett squeezed her hands. "You'll be fine, dear. There's good opportunity in Wyoming for a woman who isn't afraid of hard work. And if you don't mind my saying, that trail boss seems to have a particular interest in your welfare." The observation made Josephine flush. "Mr. Zimmerman is simply being kind. He offered me this position when I had few options." Mrs. Bennett hummed skeptically. "Well, kindness is a fine foundation for more tender feelings. Keep your eyes open, dear. Good men are rare in these parts." Before Josephine could protest further, Yates called for the company to move out. With a final thank you to Mrs. Bennett, she climbed back into her wagon, the package of small luxuries clutched to her chest like a treasure. That evening, after the men had eaten and most had retired to their bedrolls, Josephine indulged in the luxury of washing with the lavender soap in a small stream that ran near their camp. The simple pleasure of feeling clean again lifted her spirits immeasurably. She was just returning to her wagon, her hair still damp but neatly braided, when she encountered Yates standing near the fire. He looked up at her approach, and something in his expression made her heartbeat quicken. "You look refreshed," he observed, "Mrs. Bennett at the trading post gave me some soap," she explained. "It's amazing how such a small thing can make one feel human again after weeks on the trail." Yates smiled. "It suits you looking happy." The comment, delivered with such simple sincerity, caught her off guard. "I suppose I am, in a way," she admitted. "Happier than I expected to be, given the circumstances that brought me here." "Sometimes the worst circumstances lead us to exactly where we need to be," he said, poking at the embers of the fire. "I never would have become a cowboy if my family hadn't lost everything in the war. At the time, it seemed like the end of the world. Now I can't imagine any other life." Josephine considered his words. "Do you ever miss having a home, a place that's truly yours?" "Sometimes," he acknowledged. "Particularly on cold nights or during the worst storms. But then I look up at the stars and remember that my home is as big as the sky itself." His poetic response surprised her. There was depth to Yates Zimmerman that belied his practical exterior, a thoughtfulness that emerged in these quiet conversations. "The newspaper Mrs. Bennet gave me had an advertisement for a teaching position in Laramie," she said, changing the subject. "Do you think I might qualify for something like that? I completed all the schooling available in Gunnison." "I think you could do whatever you set your mind to, Miss Owens," he replied without hesitation. "But I was under the impression you were considering staying at the Blackwell Ranch, at least initially." "I am," she assured him. "I'm just considering my options for the future," he nodded, seeming pleased by her answer. "That's wise, though I will say that Mrs. Blackwell has mentioned wanting to start a small school for the children of the ranch workers. Your timing might be fortunate." The possibility sparked something in Josephine, a vision of a future that combined the security of ranch work with the fulfillment of teaching. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she left Gunnison. As if reading her thoughts, Yates added, "Nothing is certain until we arrive, of course, but I believe you'll find a place there if that's what you want." There was a question beneath his statement, one that Josephine wasn't yet ready to answer. Did she want to stay at the Blackwell Ranch, or was she already looking beyond it to whatever might come next, and how much did Yates Zimmerman factor into those calculations? "I suppose we'll see when we get there," she said finally. "For now, I'm just trying to take each day as it comes." A sensible approach, he agreed, though she thought she detected a hint of disappointment in his tone. "Well, I should let you get some rest. We've got a long stretch ahead tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Josephine called after him. "Mr. Zimmerman," he paused, looking back at her. "Yes, Miss Owens. Thank you, not just for the job, but for—" She hesitated, not sure how to articulate the mixture of gratitude and something more complex that she felt toward him. "For making me feel like I belong here, even temporarily." His expression softened. "You do belong, Josephine, more than you know." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it lingered in the air between them long after he had walked away. The following week brought new challenges as they entered more rugged territory. The cattle grew restless, and 2 attempted stampedes left everyone exhausted and on edge. A young cowboy was thrown from his horse during one such incident, breaking his arm in the fall. Josephine, drawing on experience gained caring for injured farmhands, set the bone and fashioned a splint that earned her additional respect from the men. The injury forced a reorganization of the watch schedule, which meant longer hours for everyone, including Yates. Josephine noticed the strain beginning to show on his face, the shadows beneath his eyes deepening. His customary patience occasionally giving way to sharp commands when the men were slow to respond. On the 3rd night after the accident, she deliberately stayed awake until he returned from his watch, then offered him a cup of coffee as he passed her wagon. "You should be sleeping," he said, accepting the coffee nonetheless. "So should you," she countered. "But since neither of us is, we might as well have some company." He smiled tiredly, leaning against her wagon. "Fair enough, though I warn you, I'm poor company when exhausted." "I'll risk it," she replied, pouring a cup for herself. "Besides, I wanted to check on you. You've been pushing yourself too hard since Jim's accident. Someone has to pick up the slack," he said with a shrug. "We're still a week from the Blackwell Ranch, and we've got rough country ahead." Josephine studied him in the faint light from her small lantern. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Is something else bothering you?" she asked gently. Yates was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee. "Just thinking about what awaits at the end of this drive," he finally admitted. "The Blackwells are good people, and they'll treat you well. But once we deliver the cattle, my men and I will be moving on to the next job." The implication was clear, and it sent an unexpected pang through Josephine's heart. In the weeks they had traveled together, Yates had become more than just her employer or protector. He was the first person she looked for each morning, the one whose approval mattered most, whose conversation she sought at the end of each day. The prospect of his departure left a hollow feeling in her chest. "Where will you go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Back to Colorado for another herd, most likely. The Blackwells have a standing contract with a rancher near Pueblo for fall delivery. So you'll return to Wyoming eventually, he nodded. By October, probably, before the worst of the winter weather. The information shouldn't have provided as much comfort as it did. 3 months was a long time, and there was no guarantee that Josephine would still be at the Blackwell Ranch by then, or that Yates would seek her out if she was. "I've been thinking," she said, changing the subject. "About what you said regarding Mrs. Blackwell wanting to start a school. If that's true, I could offer to teach. I've kept up with my reading, and I was always at the top of my class in Gunnison." "I think that's a fine idea," he said, his expression brightening. "You'd make an excellent teacher." His confidence in her abilities warmed something inside Josephine. It would be a way to contribute beyond just cooking or cleaning, to build something that might last. "Is that important to you? Building something that lasts?" The question seemed to carry weight beyond its simple phrasing. "Yes," she answered thoughtfully. "I suppose it is. My parents built our farm from nothing, and even though I ultimately lost it, the knowledge and values they instilled in me remain. I'd like to pass those things on in my own way." Yates was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're a remarkable woman, Josephine Owens." Before she could respond, a call from one of the night watchmen broke the moment. "Riders approaching, boss," instantly alert, Yates set down his coffee cup. "Stay in your wagon," he instructed Josephine, "and keep that rifle of yours handy, just in case." Heart pounding, she watched him stride toward the perimeter of the camp, where several cowboys had already gathered with weapons at the ready. Night riders rarely brought good news, especially in this remote stretch of territory known for occasional raids by both bandits and displaced Native American groups. From her wagon, Josephine could hear voices but couldn't make out the words. She gripped her father's rifle, wondering if she would have the courage to use it if necessary. The minutes stretched, each one taut with tension until finally Yates returned to the camp, accompanied by 2 strangers, a man and a woman, both on horseback. To her surprise, the woman dismounted and approached her wagon directly. "You must be Miss Owens," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Eleanor Blackwell. My husband Richard and I were on our way back from Cheyenne when we ran across your camp." Stunned, Josephine shook the offered hand. Eleanor Blackwell was perhaps 45, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Despite the dust of travel, there was an elegance to her bearing that spoke of breeding and education. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwell," Josephine managed. "Though I'm surprised you knew who I was." Eleanor smiled. Yates mentioned in his last letter that he had hired a female cook for the drive, quite unprecedented, as I'm sure you're aware. When I saw a woman's wagon among the camp, I knew it must be you. Josephine glanced at Yates, who was deep in conversation with Mr. Blackwell nearby. He had written to the Blackwells about her. The knowledge added another layer to her confusion about his intentions. "Yates also mentioned that you might be interested in staying on at our ranch," Eleanor continued. "We would certainly welcome another woman. It gets rather lonely being surrounded by cowboys and ranch hands, capable as they may be." "That's very kind of you," Josephine replied. "I was actually hoping to discuss the possibility of teaching. Mr. Zimmerman mentioned you were interested in starting a school for the children on your ranch." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Indeed we are. Richard and I have been corresponding with a school board in Boston about sending a teacher, but the process has been dreadfully slow. Do you have experience teaching?" "Not formally," Josephine admitted. "But I completed all the schooling available in Gunnison, and I've always loved learning. My mother taught me literature and history beyond what was offered in our small school, and my father ensured I could manage accounts and business correspondence." "That sounds more than adequate for our needs," Eleanor assured her. "Most of our workers' children have had little or no formal education. Even basic reading, writing, and arithmetic would be a vast improvement." The conversation flowed easily from there, with Eleanor sharing her vision for the school and Josephine offering suggestions based on her own education. By the time Richard Blackwell joined them, followed by Yates, the 2 women were talking like old friends. "I see you 2 have found common ground," Richard observed with a smile. He was a tall man with a full beard, and the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, but his eyes held the same intelligence and warmth as his wife's. "More than that," Elena replied. "I believe we've found our teacher, darling. Miss Owens has agreed to help us establish the school once the cattle drive arrives at the ranch." Josephine's eyes widened. "I didn't exactly, unless you've changed your mind." Elena looked concerned. "No, not at all," Josephine hastily assured her. "I would be honored to teach." "I was just surprised by how quickly it all came together." Richard laughed. "That's Elena for you. Once she sets her mind on something, there's no stopping her. It's how our ranch grew from 100 acres to 10,000 in less than a decade." The conversation turned to practical matters, then the final week of the cattle drive, the conditions at the ranch, and the arrangements for Josephine once they arrived. The Blackwells would continue their journey to the ranch ahead of the cattle drive, preparing for their arrival. "We'll have quarters ready for you in the main house," Elena promised as they prepared to leave. "Nothing fancy, but certainly more comfortable than this wagon has been." After the Blackwells departed, the camp gradually settled back into its routine. Josephine found herself too keyed up to sleep, her mind racing with the possibilities that had just opened before her. A teaching position, comfortable quarters, the friendship of a woman like Elena Blackwell, it was more than she had dared to hope for when she left Gunnison. She was still sitting by her small fire when Yates approached again. "I hope you don't mind that I mentioned you in my correspondence with the Blackwells," he said, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Not at all," she assured him, "though you might have warned me they knew I was coming. I was completely unprepared to meet them tonight. I didn't know they were traveling to Cheyenne," he explained. "They usually send a foreman for business matters." Josephine nodded, accepting his explanation. "Mrs. Blackwell seems wonderful. Very different from what I expected of a rancher's wife. She was a schoolteacher in Philadelphia before she married Richard," Yates told her. "They met when he was back east securing investors for his ranch. She gave up a comfortable life to follow him west, but I've never heard her express a single regret." The story resonated with Josephine. "It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind for an uncertain future." "Yes," he agreed, his gaze steady on her face. "It does." There it was again, that undercurrent of meaning in their conversation, the sense that they were talking about more than just Elena Blackwell's life choices. "Will you stay at the ranch for a while after the cattle are delivered?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "A few days, perhaps," he replied. "There's usually paperwork to handle, supplies to gather for the return journey, and then Colorado." "And then Colorado," he confirmed, "though I find myself less eager for the journey south than I usually am." The admission hung in the air between them, neither willing to acknowledge its implication directly. Finally, Josephine gathered her courage. "I'll miss our conversations, Mr. Zimmerman." His expression softened. "Yates," he corrected gently. "After all these weeks, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." "Yates," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her tongue. "And you should call me Josephine, not Miss Owens." "Josephine," he said, the name almost a caress in his deep voice. "I'll miss our conversations too." "More than I probably should." Before either could say more, a call came from across the camp, another cowboy with a question that required the trail boss's attention. Yates sighed, the moment broken. "I should go. Try to get some sleep. We're moving out at first light." As he walked away, Josephine remained by her fire, thoughts tumbling over each other like leaves in a storm. The week ahead suddenly seemed both too long and not long enough, too many days of uncertainty before reaching the ranch. Yet too few remaining opportunities to understand what was developing between her and Yates. The final week of the journey was the most physically demanding yet, as they navigated rocky terrain and crossed two rivers swollen with late summer rain. The cattle grew increasingly difficult to manage as they sensed the end of their journey, requiring constant vigilance from the cowboys. Josephine's days were filled with cooking, cleaning, and occasionally tending to minor injuries among the men. Her nights were spent in exhausted sleep, with little opportunity for private conversations with Yates. On the evening before they were set to reach the Blackwell Ranch, a tension of anticipation hung over the camp. The cowboys were looking forward to proper beds, hot baths, and the generous bonus that Richard Blackwell was known to provide for successful deliveries. For Josephine, the feelings were more complicated excitement about her new position, mixed with anxiety over the coming separation from Yates, and the company of men who had become something like family over the past month. As she finished washing the dinner dishes in a small creek, Josephine heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find Yates standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "The men wanted me to convey their thanks for all the meals these past weeks," he said. "Particularly tonight's. They said it was the best they've had on any drive." Josephine smiled, touched by the message. "It was just a simple stew, but please tell them they're welcome. They've been good to me, all of you have." Yates stepped closer, helping her gather the clean dishes. "What you did coming with us, adapting to trail life, never complaining even when conditions were miserable, it's rare, Josephine. Most women would have given up or made everyone miserable with their complaints." "I had something to prove, I suppose," she admitted. "To myself, if no one else. That I could survive losing everything and still find a way forward." "You've more than proven that," he said softly. "You've thrived where others would have merely endured." The praise warmed her from within, especially coming from him. Over the weeks, she had come to value Yates' good opinion above all others. His quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and the gentle consideration he showed not just to her, but to all under his care had gradually transformed her initial gratitude into something deeper and more complex. They walked back to camp together, the dishes packed away in her wagon. The men were gathered around the fire, sharing stories and passing a bottle of whiskey, a rare indulgence permitted on the final night of a successful drive. "Join us," Yates asked, gesturing toward the fire. Josephine hesitated only briefly before nodding. For a little while, they settled at the edge of the group, where Josephine could observe without feeling conspicuous. The stories flowed freely, most of them humorous tales of past drives or misadventures in various towns along the cattle trails. She found herself laughing along, occasionally catching Yates' eye when a particularly outrageous claim was made. As the night deepened, one of the older cowboys produced a battered guitar and began to play, his calloused fingers drawing surprisingly sweet melodies from the worn instrument. A few of the men sang along to familiar trail songs, their voices harmonizing in a way that spoke of many shared evenings like this one. Then the guitarist shifted to a slower tune, a love song that Josephine vaguely recognized from her childhood. The lyrics spoke of separation and longing, of hearts connected despite distance. As the mournful notes drifted into the night air, she became acutely aware of Yates beside her, his arm almost but not quite touching hers. The song ended, leaving a poignant silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. One by one, the cowboys began to retire to their bedrolls, thanking Josephine again for her cooking and service as they passed. Eventually, only she and Yates remained by the dying fire. "I should get some rest too," she said reluctantly, rising to her feet. Yates stood with her. "I'll walk you to your wagon." It was only a short distance across the camp, but Josephine was grateful for the few extra moments in his company. When they reached the wagon, she turned to face him, suddenly unsure what to say on this last night before everything changed again. "Josephine," he began, then seemed to struggle with his words, unusual for a man who typically spoke with such clarity and purpose. "I want you to know that if circumstances were different, if we weren't arriving at the ranch tomorrow, if I didn't have obligations to fulfill—" "Don't," she interrupted gently. "Please don't say things that will only make tomorrow harder." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight catching the planes of his face. "You're right," he finally said. "This isn't the time, but will you promise me something, if I can? Promise you'll still be at the Blackwell Ranch when I return in October." The request took her breath away. It wasn't a declaration of love, or even a clear indication of his intentions, but it was a request for time to explore whatever was growing between them without the pressures and limitations of the trail. "I promise," she said softly. "Unless something truly extraordinary happens, I'll be there." Relief washed over his features. "That's all I ask, for now." He reached out hesitantly and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin as he raised her fingers to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. "Good night, Josephine," he said, releasing her hand. "Good night, Yates," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, Josephine climbed into her wagon, her heart racing with emotions she had long thought buried beneath the weight of grief and worry. For the first time in nearly a year, she allowed herself to imagine a future not just of survival, but of joy. The Blackwell Ranch appeared on the horizon shortly after midday the following day. Even from a distance, Josephine could see it was an impressive operation, a large main house surrounded by numerous outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses, with vast pastures stretching in all directions. As they drew closer, workers emerged to help guide the cattle into holding pens, while Richard and Alina Blackwell came out to greet the arriving drive. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. The cattle were counted and inspected, the cowboys settled into the bunkhouse, and Josephine was shown to her room in the main house, a comfortable space with a real bed, a washstand, and even a small bookshelf stocked with volumes that Alina thought might interest her. "Dinner will be at 6, Alina informed her. "But please take your time settling in. You must be exhausted after your journey." Left alone, Josephine took advantage of the luxury of a proper bath, washing away weeks of trail dust and grime. She changed into her one good dress, salvaged from her home in Gunnison, and arranged her few possessions around the room. Even with these small touches, it felt strange to be surrounded by 4 solid walls again, to know that she wouldn't be packing up and moving on come morning. At dinner, she was seated between Alina and one of the ranch foremen, with Richard at the head of the table and Yates across from her. The conversation flowed easily, with much of it focused on the successful cattle drive and plans for the school that Josephine would help establish. Throughout the meal, she was acutely aware of Yates' presence, though they spoke directly to each other only a few times. After dinner, Richard invited the men to his study for cigars and whiskey, while Alina suggested Josephine might enjoy seeing the small building that would serve as the schoolhouse. "It's only a converted storage shed at the moment," Alina explained as they walked across the ranch yard in the gathering dusk. "But Richard has promised to have proper windows installed before winter, and we've ordered desks and books from Denver." The building was indeed humble, a single room with rough plank walls, but Josephine could immediately see its potential. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "With a coat of whitewash, some curtains for the windows, and a few pictures on the walls, it will make a fine schoolroom." Alina beamed at her enthusiasm. "I knew you were the right person for this. Yates has quite an eye for character." Josephine felt her cheeks warm at the mention of Yates. "He's been very kind to me." "More than kind, I think," Alina observed shrewdly. "I've known that man for 5 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Unsure how to respond, Josephine turned to examine a rough shelf built into one wall. "How many children will be attending the school?" she asked, deliberately changing the subject. Alina allowed the diversion, though her knowing smile suggested she understood exactly what Josephine was doing. 12, ranging from 5 to 14 years of age. Most have had little or no formal education, but they're bright children, eager to learn. They discussed curriculum and schedules as they walked back to the main house, with Alina providing insights about each child's background and abilities. By the time they returned, Josephine was genuinely excited about beginning her teaching duties the following week. The men were still sequestered in Richard's study, so Alina showed Josephine to the parlor. "I usually read or so in the evenings," she explained. "You're welcome to join me or to retire early if you prefer." "I'd love to join you," Josephine replied, grateful for the older woman's companionship. As they settled with their respective activities, Alina with her embroidery, Josephine with a book from the well-stocked shelves, she reflected on how quickly her life had changed. Just over a month ago, she had been facing the loss of everything she valued. Now she had meaningful work, comfortable surroundings, and the friendship of a woman like Alina Blackwell. The sound of male voices in the hallway announced the end of the meeting in Richard's study. Alina looked up from her embroidery. "Richard often invites Yates to stay in the guest room rather than return to the bunkhouse," she mentioned casually. The men can be rather boisterous on their first night after a long drive. Before Josephine could respond to this seemingly innocent observation, the parlor door opened and Richard entered, followed by Yates. Both men appeared relaxed, though there was a formality to Yates' bearing that hadn't been present on the trail. "Ladies," Richard greeted them. "I trust you had a pleasant evening." "Very pleasant," Eleanor confirmed. "I've been showing Josephine the schoolhouse and discussing our plans for the children's education." "Excellent," Richard approved. "And Yates here has agreed to stay in the house tonight, rather than subject himself to the celebration in the bunkhouse. I hope that meets with your approval, my dear." "Of course," Eleanor replied with a smile that suggested she had expected nothing less. "The guest room is always ready." Conversation flowed easily for another hour, with Richard sharing news from Cheyenne and Yates, discussing cattle prices and market conditions. Throughout, Josephine was struck by the easy camaraderie among them, the sense that she was being welcomed into an established family circle rather than merely employed as a teacher. When Eleanor finally suggested it was time to retire, Josephine rose gratefully, the exhaustion of the journey catching up with her at last. Richard escorted his wife upstairs, leaving Josephine momentarily alone with Yates in the parlor. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "Being in a real house again, knowing you'll wake up in the same place tomorrow." "Strange," she admitted. "But good, the Blackwells are wonderful people." "The best I know," he agreed. "I'm glad you'll be here with them while I'm gone." The reminder of his impending departure sent a pang through her heart. "When will you leave?" "Day after tomorrow," he said. "There's paperwork to finish tomorrow, supplies to gather." Josephine nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. The intimacy of their last evening on the trail seemed distant now, constrained by the formality of the house and their changed circumstances. "Good night, Josephine," Yates said finally. "Sleep well." "Good night," she replied, forcing a smile before turning to climb the stairs to her room. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive that night. Josephine tossed and turned on the comfortable mattress, her thoughts churning with questions about the future. Had she misinterpreted Yates' interest? Was he simply being kind to a woman in difficult circumstances? And even if his feelings matched hers, what future could there be for a cattle drive trail boss and a schoolteacher? The following day brought little opportunity for private conversation, as Josephine was fully occupied with Eleanor's tour of the ranch, introductions to the families whose children she would teach, and preparations for the first day of school the following week. She glimpsed Yates occasionally conferring with Richard in the study, inspecting cattle in the pens, speaking with his men, but their paths didn't cross directly until dinner. Once again, the meal was pleasant but provided no chance for personal exchange. After the plates were cleared, Richard suggested a walk to view the sunset from a nearby ridge, an invitation that included all of them. As they strolled through the golden evening light, Josephine found herself naturally falling into step beside Yates, a little behind Richard and Eleanor. "You seem to be settling in well," he observed. "Everyone has been very welcoming," she replied. "And the prospect of teaching is exciting. I never imagined I'd have such an opportunity." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I told you that losing your farm might lead you to something better." "You did," she acknowledged, "though I didn't believe it at the time." And now, she considered the question, looking ahead to where Richard and Eleanor walked arm in arm, clearly still deeply attached after years of marriage. "Now I think perhaps you were right. This feels like a place where I could belong." "I'm glad," he said softly. "You deserve to find happiness, Josephine." There was so much she wanted to say, questions she wanted to ask about his feelings, his intentions, whether his request that she remain until October meant what she hoped it did. But the presence of the Blackwells just ahead held her back. They reached the ridge just as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The view was spectacular, rolling grasslands stretching toward the horizon, the buildings of the ranch appearing small and orderly in the distance, cattle grazing peacefully in the lush pastures. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed. "This is why we came west," Richard said, his arm around Alina's waist. For this sense of endless possibility of building something from nothing. Worth giving up Philadelphia? Yates asked Alina with a teasing smile. Every day, she replied without hesitation. Though I do occasionally miss proper theater and bookshops. As darkness fell, they made their way back to the house, the conversation flowing easily among the four of them. Once again, Josephine found herself marveling at how quickly she had been accepted into this circle, how natural it felt to walk beside Yates under the emerging stars. After a final cup of coffee in the parlor, Alina announced that she was retiring for the night, with Richard following suit shortly thereafter. This time, their departure felt less like coincidence and more like a deliberate opportunity for Josephine and Yates to speak privately. For a moment after the door closed behind the Blackwells, neither spoke. The crackling fire and the ticking of the mantel clock were the only sounds in the comfortable room. Finally, Yates broke the silence. I wanted to speak with you alone before I leave tomorrow, he said, his voice low and serious. To make sure you understand why I asked you to still be here when I return. Josephine's heart quickened, but she kept her expression composed. I think I do understand, but I'd rather hear it from you directly. He smiled slightly at that. Direct as always, it's one of the things I admire about you. He took a deep breath. Josephine, in the weeks we've traveled together, I've come to care for you in a way I didn't expect. You're unlike any woman I've ever known, strong, resourceful, determined, yet also kind and gentle when the situation calls for it. The words warmed her from within, but she needed more clarity. And what does that mean, Yates, that you admire these qualities in me? It means, he said, moving to sit beside her on the small sofa, that I find myself thinking about you when I should be focusing on the cattle or the trail ahead. It means I look forward to our conversations at the end of each day more than anything else. It means the prospect of leaving tomorrow without knowing if this whatever is between us has a future is more difficult than I can express. Josephine's breath caught at the naked honesty in his voice. And October, what happens then? That depends on you, he said gently. If after these months apart, you find your feelings match mine, I'd like to court you properly with the Blackwells' approval and supervision, of course. If not, I'll respect your decision and we'll remain friends. It was more than she had hoped for, this clear declaration of intent without pressure or demand. And if my feelings already match yours, she asked softly. If I don't need months to decide, the hope that flared in his eyes was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. Then October can't come soon enough, he said, carefully taking her hand. But I would still want to do this right. You deserve a proper courtship, not a rushed decision made in the emotional aftermath of such significant changes in your life. Josephine appreciated his consideration, even as part of her wish to throw caution to the wind. You're a good man, Yates Zimmerman, she said, squeezing his hand. And yes, I will be here in October, not just because I promised, but because I want to see where this leads us. The relief and joy that transformed his expression was worth any uncertainty the coming months might hold. May I write to you while I'm gone? He asked. I would be disappointed if you didn't, she replied with a smile. He raised her hand to his lips, as he had done that last night on the trail, but this time the gesture felt like a beginning rather than a farewell. I should let you rest, he said reluctantly. Dawn comes early and I have a long journey ahead. As they rose, Josephine gathered her courage for one final question. Yates, have you ever considered a life beyond the cattle drives, a more permanent arrangement somewhere? He understood immediately what she was asking. I have, he admitted, more frequently in recent weeks than ever before. Richard mentioned today that he's looking for someone to manage the northern section of the ranch, someone who knows cattle and can supervise the men working that territory. He offered me the position, starting after this final drive to Colorado and back. Hope surged through Josephine. And what did you tell him? That I would consider it, Yates said carefully. It would mean a home base here at the ranch, with occasional trips to oversee cattle sales or purchases, but nothing like the months-long absences of the drives. And would you be happy with such an arrangement? After years of freedom under the open sky, he looked at her steadily. With the right reason to stay in one place, yes, I believe I would be very happy indeed. The implication was clear, and it filled Josephine with a warmth that chased away the lingering chill of uncertainty. "Then I look forward to continuing this conversation in October, Mr. Zimmerman." "As do I, Miss Owens," he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "As do I." Morning came too quickly, with the hustle of departure evident in the yard outside Josephine's window. She dressed hastily and made her way downstairs, determined to see Yates off properly despite the knot of emotion in her throat. The cowboys were already mounted, the pack animals loaded with supplies for the journey south. Yates stood with Richard, reviewing final details as Alina supervised the distribution of food parcels for the trail. When Josephine appeared on the porch, Yates looked up, his expression brightening despite the early hour. He excused himself from Richard and crossed to her, hat in hand. "I was afraid I might miss you," he said. "I wouldn't have let you leave without saying goodbye," she assured him. They stood for a moment in awkward silence, both aware of the eyes watching them, the curious cowboys, the knowing Blackwells, the ranch hands going about their morning chores. "I'll write as soon as we reach Pueblo," Yates finally said, "and you can send letters care of the Harrison Ranch there. They'll hold them until I arrive." "I'll do that," she promised. "Be safe, Yates." He took her hand, holding it between both of his. "Take care of yourself, Josephine. And remember what we discussed." "I will," she said softly, "until October." With a final squeeze of her hand, he released her, donned his hat, and mounted his horse. The company moved out a few minutes later, with Yates casting one last glance over his shoulder as they rode away from the ranch. Josephine watched until they disappeared over the distant ridge, her emotions a complex mixture of sadness at the parting and hope for what lay ahead. When she finally turned back toward the house, she found Alina waiting on the porch with an understanding smile. "It's never easy to watch them ride away," the older woman said gently. "Even after all these years, I still feel a pang when Richard leaves on business." "Does it get easier?" Josephine asked. "No," Alina admitted, "but the joy of reunion makes the separation worthwhile." She linked her arm through Josephine's. "Now, shall we finish preparing the schoolhouse? The children will be arriving on Monday, and there's still much to do." Grateful for the distraction, Josephine threw herself into preparations for the school's opening. The work was satisfying in a way she hadn't experienced since losing the farm. Purposeful, creative, building something that would benefit others. By the time Monday arrived, the schoolhouse had been transformed with whitewashed walls, cheerful curtains, and educational charts that Alina had ordered from Denver. The children proved to be as eager and bright as Alina had described, if somewhat lacking in formal education. Josephine quickly established a routine, dividing them into groups based on ability rather than age, and tailoring lessons to their individual needs. The days passed quickly, filled with the rewards and challenges of teaching young minds. True to his word, Yates' first letter arrived 3 weeks after his departure, delivered by a supply wagon from Cheyenne. Josephine's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, retreating to the privacy of her room to read his words. The letter was everything she had hoped for: detailed descriptions of the journey south, humorous anecdotes about the men, and most importantly, clear expressions of his growing feelings for her. He wrote of missing their conversations, of thinking of her when he saw a particularly beautiful sunset, of his increasing certainty that the position Richard had offered would be his future. Josephine read the letter 3 times before sitting down to compose her reply. She told him about the school, about the children's progress, about the feeling of purpose she had found in teaching. And she wrote, with careful honesty, about her own developing feelings, the way she looked for him in every rider approaching the ranch, how she sometimes caught herself planning what to tell him about her day before remembering he wasn't there. This exchange of letters continued through August and September, each communication deepening their connection despite the physical distance between them. Josephine found herself sharing thoughts and dreams she had never articulated to anyone else: her childhood ambitions, her fears after losing her parents, her growing attachment to the Blackwell Ranch and its people. Yates' letters revealed a similar opening of his heart: memories of his family before the war, the loneliness of his early years as a cowboy, his gradual realization that the constant movement of his life had become an escape from forming deeper connections. In one particularly moving letter, he confessed that meeting her had made him recognize the emptiness at the core of his wandering existence. "For years, I thought freedom meant never staying in one place long enough to feel its loss," he wrote. "Now I understand that true freedom comes from having someone to return to, a place where one belongs completely and without reservation." As October approached, Josephine found herself counting the days with increasing anticipation. The school was flourishing, with even the most reluctant children making steady progress. She had formed friendships with several of the ranch wives, particularly Sarah Jensen, whose husband managed the horse breeding program and whose quick wit matched Josephine's own. Eleanor had become something of a mentor, sharing not only her educational knowledge, but also her experiences as a woman who had chosen an unconventional path in life. "When I first told my parents I was moving west with Richard, they thought I had lost my mind," she confided one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "My father didn't speak to me for a year, but I knew in my heart it was right." "And you never regretted it?" Josephine asked. "Not the decision itself, though there have been difficult times," Eleanor admitted. "The isolation was harder than I expected in those early years. The winters can be brutal, and there were moments when I missed the comforts and culture of Philadelphia acutely." She smiled reflectively. "But whenever I questioned my choice, Richard would remind me of all we were building together, not just for ourselves but for everyone who works here. That sense of purpose sustained me through the hardest times." Josephine thought of Yates, of the life they might build if his feelings remained as steadfast as his letters suggested. "I never imagined myself as a rancher's wife," she mused. "When I was a girl, I dreamed of traveling to Europe, of seeing the great cities my mother told me about." "Those dreams don't have to die," Eleanor said gently. "Richard and I traveled to Europe for our 20th anniversary. It was all the more meaningful for having waited, for having earned it through years of hard work." The conversation gave Josephine a new perspective on the choices before her, not as limitations or compromises, but as the foundation for a life that could encompass many dreams over time. It was a comforting thought, as October arrived with no word yet on when exactly Yates would return. The waiting ended on a brisk afternoon in mid-October, as Josephine was dismissing her students for the day. A shout from one of the ranch hands alerted her to riders approaching from the south. Her heart leapt at the news, though she cautioned herself that it could be any number of visitors, not necessarily Yates. Still, she found herself hurrying through the final tasks of organizing the schoolroom, her hands shaking slightly as she stacked books and wiped the slate board clean. By the time she emerged, the riders were dismounting in the yard, and there, among them, was Yates, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Josephine forced herself to walk, not run, across the yard toward the main house where the Blackwells had emerged to greet the arrivals. She was acutely conscious of her appearance, the simple dress she wore for teaching, her hair neatly but not elaborately arranged, a smudge of chalk dust that might be on her sleeve. None of it mattered when Yates turned and saw her approaching. The joy that lit his face at the sight of her washed away any concerns about her appearance. He handed his reins to one of the ranch hands and moved toward her, removing his hat as he did so. "Josephine," he said simply when they stood before each other, but her name on his lips contained volumes of meaning. "Welcome back," she replied, struggling to maintain a composed demeanor despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I trust your journey was successful." "In every way," he confirmed, his eyes never leaving her face. "The cattle were delivered, the business concluded, and I'm here as promised." "I'm glad," she said softly. "I've been looking forward to your return." Something in her expression must have conveyed the depth of that statement, for his own features softened with understanding. "As have I, more than words can express." Their reunion was necessarily public, with the Blackwells, Cowboys, and curious ranch hands all within earshot. But the connection between them was palpable even in that brief exchange, a current of emotion that needed no physical demonstration to be felt by both. Dinner that evening was a celebration. with Richard opening bottles of wine he had brought back from Cheyenne and Aliner preparing a feast that showcased the best of the ranch's produce and meat. Yates sat beside Josephine, their conversation flowing as easily as if they had never been parted, yet with a new undercurrent of awareness that made every glance, every accidental touch of their hands, electric with meaning. After the meal, as had become their custom, the four of them retired to the parlor. Richard was eager to hear details of the cattle sale that Yates had overseen in Colorado, while Aliner drew Josephine into a separate conversation about plans for a Christmas pageant at the school. This division allowed the evening to progress naturally, without the strain of forcing private matters into a public setting. When Aliner finally suggested retiring for the night, Richard made a show of remembering important documents in his study that he needed Yates to review. The transparency of the maneuver might have been amusing if Josephine hadn't been so grateful for the opportunity it provided. Left alone in the parlor, she and Yates regarded each other with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "Your letters meant everything to me," she said, breaking the silence. "As yours did to me," he replied. "I read each one so many times the paper began to wear thin." "And did they change anything for you?" she asked, needing to know if his feelings had remained as constant as her own. Yates moved to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "They only confirmed what I already knew when I left here in August," he said. "That you are the woman I want to build a life with if you'll have me." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. "Are you proposing, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet," he said with a small smile. "As I promised, I want to court you properly first. But I am telling you my intentions, so there can be no doubt or confusion between us. I've accepted Richard's offer to manage the northern section of the ranch. I'll be building a house there over the winter, nothing fancy at first, but solid and warm. And I hope, by spring, to have earned the right to ask you a very important question." Josephine's heart felt too full for words. This careful, honorable man was offering her exactly what she needed: clarity about his intentions, without rushing her into a decision. The promise of a future together built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. "I accept your intentions," she said finally, reaching out to take his hand. "And I look forward to our courtship, however brief or extended it may be." The smile that broke across his face was like the sun emerging from clouds. "Does that mean I might hope for a favorable response when the time comes to ask that question?" "It means," she replied with a smile of her own, "that you have every reason to hope, Yates Zimmerman." He raised her hand to his lips, but this time, after pressing a kiss to her knuckles, he turned her palm upward and placed another kiss at its center, a more intimate gesture that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "I should say good night," he said reluctantly. "Before I forget all my good intentions about propriety and a proper courtship." Josephine nodded, equally reluctant to end their first private moment in months. "Will I see you tomorrow, after school?" "I'll be here," he promised. "Richard has given me a few days to rest before I begin work on the northern section. Perhaps you might show me your schoolhouse." "I'd like that," she agreed. The children have been curious about the famous trail boss they've heard so much about. They might even behave themselves with a visitor present. They parted at the foot of the stairs, each retreating to their separate rooms with the knowledge that something profound had shifted between them. A tentative beginning had transformed into a clear path forward, one they would walk together. The following weeks brought a joy to Josephine's life that she had never experienced before. Yates courted her with a combination of old-fashioned formality and genuine emotion that captured her heart completely. There were rides across the ranch property, with Yates proudly showing her the northern section he would manage and the site where his house, their house, though neither said it aloud yet, would stand. There were quiet evenings in the Blackwells' parlor, where conversations ranged from literature to politics to plans for the ranch's future. And there were precious moments of privacy, carefully chaperoned but meaningful nonetheless, when they shared their deepest hopes and fears for the life they were beginning to envision together. As November arrived with its shorter days and colder temperatures, construction began on Yates' house. He threw himself into the work with characteristic determination, overseeing every detail from the foundation to the roof. Josephine visited the site whenever possible, offering suggestions about the layout of rooms and the placement of windows to capture the best light. "It won't be as grand as the main house," Yates cautioned one afternoon as they stood on what would eventually be the front porch, "but it will be comfortable, and there's room to expand as needed." The implication that they might need more space for a family someday brought a flush to Josephine's cheeks. "It's perfect," she assured him, "just the right size for starting out." His eyes softened at her words at the future they contained. "That's how I see it too, a beginning, not an ending." By Christmas, the house was enclosed enough to withstand the winter weather, though the interior remained unfinished. The school's holiday pageant was a resounding success, with even the most reluctant students participating enthusiastically. Josephine felt a surge of pride as she watched her pupils perform the simple play they had rehearsed for weeks, their parents and the ranch community applauding every scene. Yates sat in the front row beside the Blackwells, his expression one of unmistakable admiration as Josephine directed the children through their parts. When it was over, he was the first to approach her, a small package wrapped in brown paper in his hands. "A Christmas gift," he explained. "Though I'd prefer you open it privately." Later that night, in the solitude of her room, Josephine carefully unwrapped the package to find a small velvet box. Inside was a locket, simple but elegant, with a delicate chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph on one side, a miniature portrait of Yates that he must have had taken during his time in Colorado. The other side was empty. A note accompanied the gift. "For the future Mrs. Zimmerman, to fill with memories of our life together. The empty space awaits your answer in the spring." Tears filled Josephine's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift, at the patient certainty with which Yates approached their relationship. She wore the locket the next day, tucked beneath the high collar of her dress where only she knew it rested, a tangible reminder of the promise between them. Winter settled over the ranch with a series of storms that made travel between the main house and Yates' construction site difficult. There were days when he couldn't make the journey, leaving Josephine to worry until he appeared again, usually covered in snow but grinning at her concern. "It would take more than a Wyoming blizzard to keep me from you," he assured her after one particularly harrowing ride through a snowstorm. "Though I'll admit, today was a close call." Despite the weather, work on the house progressed steadily. By February, Yates was able to show Josephine the nearly completed interior, the large main room with its stone fireplace, the kitchen with space for the stove she would select, the bedrooms that awaited furnishings they would choose together. "What do you think?" he asked as they stood in the main room, the February sunlight streaming through windows that faced east toward the distant mountains. "Will it do?" Josephine turned in a slow circle, absorbing the reality of this house that had been built with her in mind, with their future together as its foundation. "It's beautiful, Yates, more than I ever hoped for when I left Gunnison." He moved to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. "Spring is still weeks away," he said, his voice low and serious. "But I find I can't wait any longer to ask what I've been wanting to ask since October." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Josephine Owens, will you marry me? Will you make this house a home with me, share my life, bear my children, and grow old beside me?" Though she had anticipated this moment for months, the reality of it, Yates kneeling before her in the house he had built for them, his eyes filled with love and hope, overwhelmed Josephine with emotion. For a moment she couldn't speak, could only nod as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Yates, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, he reached into his pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "The only thing of value my father was able to save after the war. She made me promise to give it only to a woman I loved with my whole heart. I'll wear it with pride," Josephine promised, admiring the way the diamond caught the sunlight. "And I'll strive to be worthy of it and of you." They were married in April, when the prairie was beginning to green with new life and wildflowers dotted the landscape around the ranch. The ceremony took place in the main house, with Richard officiating and Alina standing as Josephine's matron of honor. The entire ranch community attended, from the cowboys who had traveled with them from Colorado to the children from Josephine's school, who presented the couple with handmade gifts and sang a song they had prepared specially for the occasion. Josephine wore a dress that Alina had helped her sew, fashioned from cream-colored silk ordered from Denver. Yates, in a new suit that made him look both distinguished and somewhat uncomfortable, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Richard's arm. The vows they exchanged were traditional but deeply felt. Each word weighted with the journey that had brought them to this moment, from her desperate situation in Gunnison to his unexpected offer. From the cattle drive that had first revealed their compatibility to the months of separation that had confirmed their feelings, from his patient courtship to the home they had prepared together. When Richard pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her with a reverence that brought tears to Josephine's eyes. The cheers of their friends and neighbors surrounded them, a joyful affirmation of the community that had embraced them both. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing in the barn, abundant food and drink, and speeches that alternated between heartfelt sentiment and good-natured teasing. Through it all, Yates kept Josephine close, his hand rarely leaving hers as they accepted congratulations and well wishes from everyone present. When they finally departed for their new home, it was under a canopy of stars, with lanterns lighting their way and the sounds of the celebration fading behind them. Yates had insisted on carrying her across the threshold, a tradition Josephine found both romantic and slightly amusing given his usual practicality. Inside, the house was transformed from the bare structure she had last seen. Furniture they had selected together filled the rooms, alongside wedding gifts from the Blackwells and others in the community. A fire burned welcomingly in the hearth, and lamps cast a warm glow over what was now their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman," Yates said softly as he set her on her feet in the main room. "I like the sound of that," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Almost as much as I like the sight of you standing in our home, knowing neither of us has to leave when the evening ends." His expression grew serious, though his eyes remained warm. "I want you to know something, Josephine. When I found you in Gunnison, I was only thinking of helping someone in need and finding a cook for my men. I had no idea that decision would change my entire life, give it meaning and purpose beyond anything I had known before." She raised a hand to his cheek, touched by his words. "And I thought I had lost everything when the bank took my farm. I couldn't see that I was being set free to find something far more precious." She smiled up at him. "It seems we saved each other in different ways." "We did," he agreed, drawing her closer, "and we'll continue to do so every day for the rest of our lives." As their lips met in a kiss that sealed their new beginning, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that the hope that had been fading in Gunnison had been rekindled into a flame that would illuminate their entire future, a future built on love, respect, and the promise of tomorrow. In the years that followed, the Zimmerman Ranch prospered under Yates' careful management. The northern section of the Blackwell property gradually transformed into a thriving operation in its own right, with Josephine proving to be as capable a partner in ranching as she had been a teacher. She continued to teach for several years, until the birth of their first child, a son they named Thomas Richard, after both their fathers made the daily journey to the schoolhouse impractical. By the time their second child arrived, a daughter, they called Elizabeth Alina, the Zimmerman house had expanded to accommodate their growing family. What had begun as a simple structure was now a comfortable home with a wrap-around porch where they could watch the sunset together, a garden that produced vegetables for their table, and a sense of permanence that neither had experienced before finding each other. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, as they sat on that porch watching Thomas and Elizabeth play in the yard, Yates turned to Josephine with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't decided to cross your land that day in Gunnison? He asked. Josephine considered the question, her hand automatically reaching for the locket she still wore now, containing photographs of both Yates and their children. I try not to, she admitted. The thought of never having our children, our home is too painful to contemplate, he nodded, understanding perfectly as he always seemed to. I believe we would have found each other somehow, even if not that day. Some things are simply meant to be. Like a cowboy and a desperate woman with nothing left but hope. She teased gently. Exactly like that, he agreed, leaning over to kiss her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. The best decision I ever made was turning my horses toward your farm. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in colors no artist could capture, Josephine Zimmerman looked at her husband, their children, and the life they had built together. From the ashes of loss and desperation had risen something beautiful and enduring, a love strong enough to weather any storm, a family bound by more than blood, a home filled with laughter and light. Her hope, once fading with each passing day in Gunnison, now burned bright and steady, illuminating not just tomorrow but all the tomorrows stretching out before them. And for that transformation, she would be forever grateful to the cowboy who had given her a reason to believe again.